Fort Bragg, North Carolina, March 1983. The temperature had not climbed above 41 degrees by 11 in the morning, and the breath of 1,000 soldiers rose in thin columns above the bleachers of the main demonstration arena. The Army had built the structure in 1971 for exactly this kind of event, a combined arms capability showcase, part ceremony, part invitation, part warning to anyone watching who had not yet decided what kind of man he intended to be. The bleachers were oak and painted gray, and they held that cold inside their grain the way only old wood can, and every man seated in them that morning had earned the right to be there through a route that most people alive would not survive the first week of. At the center of the arena floor, a demonstration mat had been laid, 40 feet by 40 feet of dense green canvas, secured at the corners with iron stakes. It was the kind of mat that does not forgive poor footwork. His name was Senior Chief Petty Officer Dale Makin. He was 31 years old. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches and weighed 218 pounds with nothing wasted in the composition. He had completed basic underwater demolition training in 1974, passed the first time, and in the 9 years since he had accumulated a record in hand-to-hand combat instruction that very few men in any branch of the United States military could match. He held a third-degree black belt in judo, awarded in Osaka under a lineage that ran back 4 generations to men who had trained before the Second World War. He held a second-degree black belt in Shotokan karate, earned not at a weekend seminar but across 6 years of twice-weekly practice under a Korean instructor who had represented his country in 2 international tournaments and never once smiled during a lesson. Makin had not lost a controlled sparring match against a military opponent in 4 years. He had conducted close-quarters training for 2 SEAL teams, 1 Ranger battalion, and a group of men whose unit designation he was not permitted to speak aloud in civilian settings. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most dangerous unarmed human beings inside the continental United States on that particular Tuesday morning. He knew this. He had been told this, first by his instructors and then by the men he had trained. And the knowledge had done to him what knowledge of that kind tends to do when it is not counterbalanced by something heavier than pride. It had made him certain. And certainty, in a man with that much skill, is not confidence. It is something closer to blindness. A narrowing of vision that happens so slowly the man it happens to is always the last to notice it. There was a figure in the bleachers at that hour who had noticed it at a distance of 30 yards, the moment Makin walked onto the arena floor. The figure was seated in the 4th row, near the left aisle, between a colonel from the 82nd Airborne and a civilian contractor whose name does not matter to this story. He wore a denim jacket over a plain white t-shirt, dark trousers and shoes that were built for walking on pavement rather than performing on a mat. His hair was slightly long for the setting. A cap was pulled down at an angle that kept his face in mild shadow from the overhead lights. He was perhaps 43 years old, though it was difficult to be certain. He did not carry himself with the forward lean of a man accustomed to being watched. He sat the way a man sits when he has nothing left to prove to a room. In the next 14 seconds, in front of 1,000 soldiers and officers and government contractors seated in that gray-painted arena at Fort Bragg, something would happen that every person present would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately and failing. None of them would fully succeed, but all of them would remember. Nobody in that arena understood yet what they were about to witness. Makin had taken the floor for the demonstration's second segment, a live-fire instruction sequence on counter-grappling for confined space environments. He was good at this. He was, by the testimony of 4 senior instructors who watched that morning, among the best live demonstrators any of them had seen. He moved with a fluency that comes only from 10,000 hours of deliberate repetition, and the soldier he used as his training partner, a large young man from the 75th Ranger Regiment, was moved, redirected and placed on the mat 4 times in the first 6 minutes with a smoothness that drew a single low murmur from the upper rows of the bleachers. After the 4th throw, Makin took the microphone from the stand at the edge of the mat. He was still breathing evenly. He held the microphone the way experienced presenters hold microphones, down and slightly to the side, so the breathing does not crowd the sound. He said several things about the sequence that had been technically accurate and useful. Then he said something else. He said said that he had read, in a publication whose name he mentioned without pause, that Chuck Norris had developed what that publication called the most effective street-applicable fighting system currently taught in American martial arts schools. He said the word street-applicable with a particular flatness. He said that he respected what Norris had done for the public profile of martial arts in the country. He said this the way a man says he respects something he does not in fact respect. Then he said, in front of 1,000 people into a live microphone, that if the system Norris taught were placed in a realistic high-stress environment against a trained combatant rather than a demonstration partner, it would not function. He said that he meant no personal disrespect. He then said the words that would become the sentence everyone remembered. He said, Steven Seagal laughed at him when they talked once in Los Angeles, and I'll tell you what, I understand why. The arena went quiet in a specific way. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of 1,000 people deciding simultaneously to pay closer attention. If you have followed this channel long enough to remember the last time we covered a story from this arena, you know what that kind of quiet means. Before we go any further, if you are watching this for the first time, make sure you are subscribed and drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from. This story does not end where you think it ends. And the sentence Makin would hear on his knees on that green canvas mat 4 minutes from now would sit in his memory for the next 4 decades. You do not want to miss the ending. What happened in the bleachers after Makin's words took 3 or 4 seconds to resolve into something visible. The colonel from the 82nd Airborne turned his head. The civilian contractor leaned fractionally forward. The figure in the 4th row, in the denim jacket, set down the paper cup of coffee he had been holding with both hands. He set it down deliberately, without haste, the way a man sets something down when he has made a decision, and the decision does not require speed to execute. He reached up and removed his cap. He folded the cap once along the brim, the crease running clean and even, and he set it on top of the paper cup. Then he stood. He was not a tall man. Standing, he was perhaps 5 feet 10 inches, and in the coat and the plain trousers he looked, from a distance, like a man who had stopped in from somewhere else, a crew member, perhaps, or a facility supervisor who had wandered into the wrong row. He did not raise his hand. He did not call out. He moved toward the aisle with the unhurried even gait of a man who has nowhere in particular to be, but has decided, for reasons of his own, to go somewhere specific. The recognition moved through the bleachers the way a pressure change moves through a room before weather arrives. It started in the lower rows, among the older officers and the senior NCOs. The men whose careers had run long enough that they had been at events where this face had also been present. It spread upward and outward, row by row, not as a shout but as a murmur, and then as a stillness that was somehow louder than the murmur. By the time the figure had descended to the arena floor and crossed the 14 feet from the bleacher rail to the edge of the mat, a considerable portion of 1,000 men understood what was happening. Senior Chief Petty Officer Dale Makin, holding the microphone, had not yet turned around. He has already lost. He simply does not know it yet. A fight is not 2 men striking each other. A fight is a conversation about distance, and the first man to understand the distance correctly is the man who has already determined the result. The outcome of most encounters decided under stress is resolved not in the moment of contact, but in the geometry of the approach, the angle chosen, the speed withheld, the ground covered or not covered in the 3 seconds before hands are raised. What most men at that skill level train is the contact. What the best men in any room train is the space before the contact. They train the distance the way a chess player trains the board, not the piece being moved, but the field that movement will change. The man in the white t-shirt understood distance the way very few living people understood it. Makin heard the shift in the room before he saw its cause. He turned. He was a professional. He had trained for 8 years to manage adrenal response, to read a room, to not be surprised by the appearance of an opponent at close range. When he turned and saw the man standing 4 feet from the edge of the mat, his expression did not break. It recalibrated. There was a recognition, the same recognition that had moved through the bleachers, and then, over it, something more complicated. Makin said, still into the microphone all right. He said it evenly. The man on the edge of the mat said nothing. He removed the denim jacket. He folded it once, along the shoulders, the way the jacket of a man who has done this before gets folded. Not to be neat, but because neatness in that moment is its own kind of statement. He set the jacket on the floor beside the mat's iron corner stake. He stepped onto the mat in the street shoes. One of the senior instructors present that morning, a man named Warren Hodge, who held a 4th degree black belt in Hapkido and had trained special operations personnel for 11 years, said later that what he witnessed in the next 14 seconds constituted the most complete technical education he had ever received in a single continuous observation. He said this in writing, in a letter that circulated among a small number of training facilities in the eastern United States through the late 1980s and early 1990s, and which was quoted, in part, in a memoir that 2 people in this story later published independently. Second one, Makin set the microphone down on its stand and moved to the center of the mat. He chose a fighting stance that favored his judo, weight distributed, hands open, the forward foot angled to facilitate hip entry on a throw. It was the correct stance for his best technique against a larger opponent. The problem was that the man across the mat had seen that stance, or stances of its family, so many times and in so many conditions that the choosing of it communicated information. It told him what Makin intended to do first. Second 2. Makin moved. He committed to a forward entry, a direct line, the kind of approach that had worked 4 times in the last 7 minutes against the Ranger from the 75th. He was fast. Everyone present agreed that he was fast. The colonel from the 82nd Airborne, who had watched Makin demonstrate 6 times in the previous 2 years, said afterward that the approach was as clean as he had ever seen Makin execute it. It did not arrive. Second 3. The man in the white t-shirt moved offline, not backward, offline, at a 40-degree angle to Makin's line of approach, a distance of perhaps 18 inches. Achieved with a single economical step that looked, to the back rows of the bleachers, like almost nothing. Like a man stepping slightly to the left of a door he had decided not to walk through. Makin's entry found only the space where someone had been. Warren Hodge, in the 6th row, placed both hands flat on the wooden seat in front of him. The boom operator from the Department of Defense Film Unit, who had been tracking the demonstration with a long lens for the official record, later said that he stopped moving the camera. He said that he had been operating equipment for 11 years and had never before stopped the camera during a subject's movement. He said he was not entirely certain why he stopped it. He said the moment did not feel like it required documentation. It felt like it required witness. Second 4. Makin adjusted. He was a 3rd degree black belt in judo. He understood redirection. He pivoted on his rear foot and attempted a second entry, this one lower, a drive for the outside of the right knee, a takedown of a different family entirely. The kind of adaptation a man makes when his first plan is cancelled. It was the right adaptation. It was what he should have tried. Any trained observer would have agreed. Second 5. The right knee was not there. The man in the white t-shirt had created distance without appearing to retreat. He had moved through the geometry of Makin's second approach the way a hand moves through smoke, present, then not present, without the impression of effort. Makin's arms closed on nothing for the second time. His momentum carried him 2 steps past the center of the mat. In the 1st row, a sergeant major with 22 years of service and a combat record that ran across 3 deployments watched this and did not blink. He said later that he had trained with 47 different martial arts instructors over the course of his career, and that he recognized, in that 5th second, a quality of presence he had encountered perhaps twice before in his life. He recognized that the man in the white t-shirt was not reacting. He was reading. He was several steps ahead of the encounter in a way that had nothing to do with speed, and everything to do with knowledge. A deep structural knowledge of how a specific kind of human being moves under a specific kind of pressure in a specific kind of room. He knew what Makin was going to do before Makin's body had committed to it. And the knowing was not dramatic. It was quiet. It was the quietest thing in the room. Second 6. Makin reset. His breathing had changed. Not broken, changed. He had been in difficult sparring before. He had been placed in disadvantaged positions before. He was a man who did not fold under pressure, and the fact that 2 entries had failed did not dismantle his composure. But his third attempt carried something his first 2 had not carried. His first 2 had carried certainty. His third carried the beginning of a question. He came in high, this time reaching for collar control, a Shotokan grip entry, abandoning the judo frame for a karate clinch. He was trying something different. He was capable of trying something different. That was a mark of his quality. Second 7. The grip never closed. What happened in the next half second was described by 6 witnesses in 7 different ways, which is the accurate signature of something that moved faster than conscious observation can cleanly record. The consensus, assembled from those 7 accounts across the years, is that a single controlled movement from the man in the white t-shirt placed both of Makin's wrists outside his own center line, created an angle that removed his structural base, and arrived at a point approximately 1 inch from the left side of Makin's jaw, a spinning rear kick, brought fully around. The heel arriving and stopping, not completing. Held, Makin was on one knee. He had not been struck. The heel had stopped 1 inch short of contact and held there, steady for a count that Warren Hodge later estimated at 2 full seconds. 2 seconds is a long time to hold a technique in suspension. 2 seconds is long enough for every person in the room to understand what has been decided and what has been withheld. The arena was silent in a way that a building holding 1,000 people is rarely silent. The man in the white t-shirt lowered the kick. He took 1 step back. He extended his right hand, open, palm upward. He waited. One of the officers in the 3rd row, a lieutenant colonel from Special Forces, said he had seen man refuse the hand before, in situations like this, and that what followed a refusal was always, in his experience, a smaller version of the man who refused it. He watched Makin on one knee and said he was not certain which way it would go. Makin looked at the extended hand for a moment that no one in that arena has ever been able to time accurately. Then he placed his own hand in it, and was helped to his feet. He stood. He was upright. He breathed. The man in the white t-shirt leaned forward and spoke 2 sentences directly into Makin's ear. He spoke quietly enough that the microphone stand 4 feet away did not record them. The content of those 2 sentences remained between the 2 men for 11 years. In 1994, Makin described them, without quoting them directly, in a letter to his instructor in Osaka. He said only that the sentences were not about him. He said they were about the work. He said they reminded him of something he had known at 22 and forgotten somewhere on the route to 31. He did not elaborate. The man in the white t-shirt released Makin's hand. He turned. He walked to the corner stake, picked up the folded denim jacket, and put it on. He walked to the bleacher rail. He climbed back to the 4th row. He retrieved his cap from the paper cup, put the cap back on his head, and sat down. Warren Hodge reached him on the way out of the arena 22 minutes later. As the demonstration was concluding, he placed a hand on the man's shoulder as he moved past, briefly, and said nothing. The man in the white t-shirt nodded once and continued walking. 2 of the witnesses present that morning were training facility directors in the civilian sector. Within 6 weeks, the account of what had happened at Fort Bragg had passed through 7 dojos in 3 states. And in the transit, certain details had altered. In some versions, the encounter lasted longer. In some versions, it involved additional participants. In the version that circulated through a network of Hapkido schools in the southeast, the kick had made contact rather than stopping short. None of the people who had been present corrected these versions with any urgency. The core of the story was accurate, and the core was what mattered to them. What mattered was not the technique. What mattered was the distance. What mattered was the quality of knowledge brought to a room by a man who had spent decades learning something deeply enough that it no longer required demonstration to be visible. The story reached Steven Seagal by the summer of 1983. What he said in response to it has not been documented by any source this production has been able to verify, and so it will not be reported here. What can be reported is that the 2 men never appeared together on a public platform in a competitive context. Makin went back to his unit. He continued instructing. He modified his curriculum in the 18 months following Fort Bragg in ways that the men who trained under him noticed without understanding the source of the revision. He added material on distance management that had not been in his program before. He added material on reading committed movement. He added material on what he called, without explaining the phrase's origin, the geometry of approach. He retired from the Navy in 1991. He opened a training facility in Virginia Beach in 1993. He ran it for 16 years. Somewhere in the documentation of that facility, in the curriculum statement he submitted to the State Athletic Commission for licensing purposes in 1993, there is a sentence, buried in the second paragraph, that those who know the Fort Bragg story read differently than anyone else reads it. The sentence says, "This curriculum is built on the understanding that technique without perception is theater, and that perception begins with knowing, before the engagement starts, what you do not yet know about the man in front of you." He did not attribute the sentence to anyone. He did not need to. What a man does with a moment of clear defeat tells you more about the shape of his character than any number of victories. The victories show you what he has built. The defeat shows you what the building is made of. Most men, in the presence of superior knowledge delivered without cruelty, experience something that can either calcify into resentment or dissolve into understanding. The dissolving takes longer. It is less comfortable in the hours immediately following, but it is the only version that produces something worth carrying forward. Dale Makin dissolved. He chose the longer route. He carried what he learned at Fort Bragg for 4 decades and distributed it, piece by piece, to several hundred men who trained under him in Virginia Beach. And none of those men were told where it came from. They were told only that it was true, and that truth about distance is always more useful than truth about technique. That is what 14 seconds in front of 1,000 soldiers can produce, if the man on one knee is honest with himself about what put him there. If this story reached you the way these stories tend to reach the people who need them, which is sideways through an algorithm you weren't paying attention to, on an evening you didn't plan to spend here, then leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. And next week, we will bring you the account of the afternoon in a Los Angeles dojo in 1987, when Chuck Norris walked into a room where he was not expected, sat down in the back row, and watched a man teach a class about him. We will tell you what he said to that man afterward. We will tell you what the man said back. You will not predict the ending. Stay with us. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double check rest.